Polikushka, a short story by Leo Tolstoy. Chapter 1. Poliki was a courtman, one of the staff of servants belonging to the court household of a boyarinia, lady of the nobility. He held a very insignificant position on the estate and lived in a rather poor, small house with his wife and children. The house was built by the deceased nobleman whose widow he still continued to serve, and may be described as follows. The four walls surrounding the one izba room were built of stone, and the interior was 10 yards square. A Russian stove stood in the center, around which was a free passage. Each corner was fenced off as a separate enclosure to the extent of several feet, and the one nearest to the door, the smallest of all, was known as Poliki's corner. Elsewhere in the room stood the bed, with quilt, sheet, and cotton pillows, the cradle, with a baby lying therein, and the three-legged table on which the meals were prepared and the family washing was done. At the latter, also Poliki was at work on the preparation of some materials for use in his profession, that of an amateur veterinary surgeon. A calf, some hens, the family clothes and household utensils, together with 7 persons, filled the little home to the utmost of its capacity. It would indeed have been almost impossible for them to move around had it not been for the convenience of the stove, on which some of them slept at night, and which served as a table in the daytime. It seemed hard to realize how so many persons managed to live in such close quarters. Poliki's wife, Akulina, did the washing, spun and wove, bleached her linen, cooked and baked, and found time also to quarrel and gossip with her neighbors. The monthly allowance of food which they received from the noblewoman's house was amply sufficient for the whole family, and there was always enough meal left to make mash for the cow. Their fuel they got free, and likewise the food for the cattle. In addition, they were given a small piece of land on which to raise vegetables. They had a cow, a calf, and a number of chickens to care for. Poliki was employed in the stables to take care of 2 stallions and, when necessary, to bleed the horses and cattle and clean their hooves. In his treatment of the animals, he used syringes, plasters, and various other remedies and appliances of his own invention. For these services, he received whatever provisions were required by his family and a certain sum of money, all of which would have been sufficient to enable them to live comfortably and even happily, if their hearts had not been filled with the shadow of a great sorrow. This shadow darkened the lives of the entire family. Poliki, while young, was employed in a horse-breeding establishment in a neighboring village. The head stableman was a notorious horse thief, known far and wide as a great rogue, who, for his many misdeeds, was finally exiled to Siberia. Under his instruction, Poliki underwent a course of training, and being but a boy, was easily induced to perform many evil deeds. He became so expert in the various kinds of wickedness practiced by his teacher that though he many times would gladly have abandoned his evil ways, he could not, owing to the great hold these early formed habits had upon him. His father and mother died when he was but a child, and he had no one to point out to him the paths of virtue. In addition to his other numerous shortcomings, Poliki was fond of strong drink. He also had a habit of appropriating other people's property when the opportunity offered of his doing so without being seen. Collar straps, padlocks, perch bolts, and things even of greater value belonging to others found their way with remarkable rapidity and in great quantities to Poliki's home. He did not, however, keep such things for his own use, but sold them whenever he could find a purchaser. His payment consisted chiefly of whiskey, though sometimes he received cash. This sort of employment, as his neighbors said, was both light and profitable. It required neither education nor labor. It had one drawback, however, which was calculated to reconcile his victims to their losses. Though he could for a time have all his needs supplied without expending either labor or money, there was always the possibility of his methods being discovered, and this result was sure to be followed by a long term of imprisonment. This impending danger made life a burden for Poliki and his family. Such a setback, indeed, very nearly happened to Poliki early in his career. He married while still young, and God gave him much happiness. His wife, who was a shepherd's daughter, was a strong, intelligent, hard-working woman. She bore him many children, each of whom was said to be better than the preceding one. Poliki still continued to steal, but once was caught with some small articles belonging to others in his possession. Among them was a pair of leather reins, the property of another peasant, who beat him severely and reported him to his mistress. From that time on, Poliki was an object of suspicion, and he was twice again detected in similar escapades. By this time, the people began to abuse him, and the clerk of the court threatened to recruit him into the army as a soldier, which is regarded by the peasants as a great punishment and disgrace. His noble mistress severely reprimanded him. His wife wept from grief for his downfall, and everything went from bad to worse. Poliki, notwithstanding his weakness, was a good-natured sort of man, but his love of strong drink had so overcome every moral instinct that at times he was scarcely responsible for his actions. This habit he vainly endeavored to overcome. It often happened that when he returned home intoxicated, his wife, losing all patience, roundly cursed him and cruelly beat him. At times he would cry like a child and bemoan his fate, saying, "Unfortunate man that I am! What shall I do? Let my eyes burst into pieces if I do not forever give up the vile habit. I will not again touch vodka." In spite of all his promises of reform, but a short period, perhaps a month, would elapse when Poliki would again mysteriously disappear from his home and be lost for several days on a spree. "From what source does he get the money he spends so freely?" the neighbors inquired of each other as they sadly shook their heads. One of his most unfortunate exploits in the matter of stealing was in connection with a clock which belonged to the estate of his mistress. The clock stood in the private office of the noblewoman, and was so old as to have outlived its usefulness, and was simply kept as an heirloom. It so happened that Poliki went into the office one day when no one was present but himself, and seeing the old clock, it seemed to possess a peculiar fascination for him, and he speedily transferred it to his person. He carried it to a town not far from the village, where he very readily found a purchaser. As if purposely to secure his punishment, it happened that the storekeeper to whom he sold it proved to be a relative of one of the court servants, and who, when he visited his friend on the next holiday, related all about his purchase of the clock. An investigation was immediately instituted, and all the details of Poliki's transaction were brought to light and reported to his noble mistress. He was called into her presence, and, when confronted with the story of the theft, broke down and confessed all. He fell on his knees before the noblewoman and pleaded with her for mercy. The kind-hearted lady lectured him about God, the salvation of his soul, and his future life. She talked to him also about the misery and disgrace he brought upon his family, and altogether so worked upon his feelings that he cried like a child. In conclusion, his kind mistress said, "I will forgive you this time on the condition that you promise faithfully to reform, and never again to take what does not belong to you." Poliki, still weeping, replied, "I will never steal again in all my life, and if I break my promise, may the earth open and swallow me up, and let my body be burned with red-hot irons." Rollicou returned to his home, and throwing himself on the oven, spent the entire day weeping and repeating the promise made to his mistress. From that time on, he was not again caught stealing, but his life became extremely sad, for he was regarded with suspicion by everyone and pointed to as a thief. When the time came around for securing recruits for the army, all the peasants singled out Poliki as the first to be taken. The superintendent was especially anxious to get rid of him and went to his mistress to induce her to have him sent away. The kind-hearted and merciful woman, remembering the peasant's repentance, refused to grant the superintendent's request and told him he must take some other man in his stead. Chapter 2. One evening, Poliki was sitting on his bed beside the table, preparing some medicine for the cattle, when suddenly the door was thrown wide open, and Aksiutka, a young girl from the court, rushed in. Almost out of breath, she said, "My mistress has ordered you, Polikai Ilich, son of Ilya, to come up to the court at once." The girl was standing and still breathing heavily from her late exertion as she continued. "Igor Mikhailovich, the superintendent, has been to see Our Lady about having you drafted into the army. And, Polikai Ilich, your name was mentioned among others. Our Lady has sent me to tell you to come up to the court immediately." As soon as Axiutka had delivered her message, she left the room in the same abrupt manner in which she had entered. Akulina, without saying a word, got up and brought her husband's boots to him. They were poor, worn-out things which some soldier had given him, and his wife did not glance at him as she handed them to him. "Are you going to change your shirt, Ilich?" she asked at last. "No," replied Poliki. Akulina did not once look at him all the time he was putting on his boots and preparing to go to the court. Perhaps, after all, it was better that she did not do so. His face was very pale, and his lips trembled. He slowly combed his hair and was about to depart without saying a word, when his wife stopped him to arrange the ribbon on his shirt, and, after toying a little with his coat, she put his hat on for him, and he left the little home. Poliki's next-door neighbors were a joiner and his wife. A thin partition only separated the two families, and each could hear what the other said and did. Soon after Poliki's departure, a woman was heard to say, "Well, Poliki Ilich, so your mistress has sent for you." The voice was that of the joiner's wife on the other side of the partition. Akulina and the woman had quarreled that morning about some trifling thing done by one of Poliki's children, and it afforded her the greatest pleasure to learn that her neighbor had been summoned into the presence of his noble mistress. She looked upon such a circumstance as a bad omen. She continued talking to herself and said, "Perhaps she wants to send him to the town to make some purchases for her household. I did not suppose she would select such a faithful man as you are to perform such a service for her. If it should prove that she does want to send you to the next town, just buy me a quarter-pound of tea. Will you, Poliki Ilich?" Poor Akulina, on hearing the joiner's wife talking so unkindly of her husband, could hardly suppress the tears, and the tirade continuing, she at last became angry, and wished she could in some way punish her. Forgetting her neighbor's unkindness, her thoughts soon turned in another direction, and glancing at her sleeping children, she said to herself that they might soon be orphans, and she herself a soldier's widow. This thought greatly distressed her, and burying her face in her hands, she seated herself on the bed, where several of her progeny were fast asleep. Presently, a little voice interrupted her meditations by crying out, "Mamushka, little mother, you are crushing me," and the child pulled her nightdress from under her mother's arms. Akulina, with her head still resting on her hands, said, "Perhaps it would be better if we all should die. I only seem to have brought you into the world to suffer sorrow and misery." Unable longer to control her grief, she burst into violent weeping, which served to increase the amusement of the joiner's wife, who had not forgotten the morning's squabble, and she laughed loudly at her neighbor's woe. Chapter 3. About half an hour had passed when the youngest child began to cry, and Akulina arose to feed it. She had by this time ceased to weep, and after feeding the infant, she again fell into her old position, with her face buried in her hands. She was very pale, but this only increased her beauty. After a time she raised her head, and staring at the burning candle, she began to question herself as to why she had married, and as to the reason that the Tsar required so many soldiers. Presently she heard steps outside, and knew that her husband was returning. She hurriedly wiped away the last traces of her tears as she arose to let him pass into the center of the room. Poliki made his appearance with a look of triumph on his face, threw his hat on the bed, and hastily removed his coat, but not a word did he utter. Akulina, unable to restrain her impatience, asked, "Well, what did she want with you?" "Pshaw," he replied. "It is very well known that Polikushka is considered the worst man in the village. But when it comes to business of importance, who is selected then? Why, Polikushka, of course. What kind of business? Aquilina timidly inquired, but Poliki was in no hurry to answer her question. He lighted his pipe with a very imposing air and spit several times on the floor before he replied. Still retaining his pompous manner, he said, "She has ordered me to go to a certain merchant in the town and collect a considerable sum of money." "You to collect money?" questioned Aquilina. Poliki only shook his head and smiled significantly, saying, "You," the mistress said to me, "are a man resting under a grave suspicion, a man who is considered unsafe to trust in any capacity. But I have faith in you and will entrust you with this important business of mine in preference to anyone else." Poliki related all this in a loud voice, so that his neighbor might hear what he had to say. "You promised me to reform," my noble mistress said to me, "and I will be the first to show you how much faith I have in your promise. I want you to ride into town, and going to the principal merchant there, collect a sum of money from him and bring it to me." I said to my mistress, "Everything you order shall be done. I will only too gladly obey your slightest wish." Then my mistress said, "Do you understand, Poliki, that your future lot depends upon the faithful performance of this duty I impose upon you?" I replied, "Yes, I understand everything, and feel that I will succeed in performing acceptably any task which you may impose upon me. I have been accused of every kind of evil deed that it is possible to charge a man with, but I have never done anything seriously wrong against you, your honor." In this way I talked to our mistress until I succeeded in convincing her that my repentance was sincere, and she became greatly softened toward me, saying, "If you are successful, I will give you the first place at the court." "And how much money are you to collect?" inquired Aquilina. 1,500 rubles, carelessly answered Poliki. Aquilina sadly shook her head as she asked, "When are you to start?" "She ordered me to leave here tomorrow," Poliki replied. "Take any horse you please," she said. "Come to the office, and I will see you there and wish you Godspeed on your journey." "Glory to thee, O Lord," said Aquilina as she arose and made the sign of the cross. "God, I am sure, will bless you, Illich," she added in a whisper, so that the people on the other side of the partition could not hear what she said, all the while holding on to his sleeve. "Illich," she cried at last excitedly, "for God's sake promise me that you will not touch a drop of vodka. Take an oath before God and kiss the cross so that I may be sure that you will not break your ear promise." Poliki replied in most contemptuous tones, "Do you think I will dare to touch vodka when I shall have such a large sum of money in my saga?" "Aquilina, have a clean shirt ready for the morning," were his parting words for the night. So Poliki and his wife went to sleep in a happy frame of mind and full of bright dreams for the future. Chapter 4. Very early the next morning, almost before the stars had hidden themselves from view, there was seen standing before Poliki's home a low wagon, the same in which the superintendent himself used to ride, and harnessed to it was a large-boned, dark-brown mare, called for some unknown reason by the name of Baraban, drum. Aniutka, Poliki's eldest daughter, in spite of the heavy rain and the cold wind which was blowing, stood outside barefooted and held, not without some fear, the reins in one hand, while with the other she endeavored to keep her green and yellow overcoat wound around her body, and also to hold Poliki's sheepskin coat. In the house there were the greatest noise and confusion. The morning was still so dark that the little daylight there was failed to penetrate through the broken panes of glass, the window being stuffed in many places with rags and paper to exclude the cold air. Aquilina ceased from her cooking for a while and helped to get Poliki ready for the journey. Most of the children were still in bed, very likely as a protection against the cold, for Aquilina had taken away the big overcoat which usually covered them and had substituted a shawl of her own. Poliki's shirt was all ready, nice and clean, but his shoes badly needed repairing, and this fact caused his devoted wife much anxiety. She took from her own feet the thick woolen stockings she was wearing and gave them to Poliki. She then began to repair his shoes, patching up the holes so as to protect his feet from dampness. While this was going on, he was sitting on the side of the bed with his feet dangling over the edge and trying to turn the sash which confined his coat at the waist. He was anxious to look as clean as possible, and he declared his sash looked like a dirty rope. One of his daughters, enveloped in a sheepskin coat, was sent to a neighbour's house to borrow a hat. Within Poliki's home, the greatest confusion reigned, for the court servants were constantly arriving with innumerable small orders which they wished Poliki to execute for them in town. One wanted needles, another tea, another tobacco, and last came the joiner's wife, who by this time had prepared her samovar and, anxious to make up the quarrel of the previous day, brought the traveller a cup of tea. Neighbour Nikita refused the loan of the hat, so the old one had to be patched up for the occasion. This occupied some time, as there were many holes in it. Finally, Poliki was all ready, and jumping on the wagon, started on his journey, after first making the sign of the cross. At the last moment, his little boy, Mishka, ran to the door, begging to be given a short ride. And then his little daughter, Mashka, appeared on the scene and pleaded that she too might have a ride, declaring that she would be quite warm enough without furs. Poliki stopped the horse on hearing the children, and Akulina placed them in the wagon, together with two others belonging to a neighbour, all anxious to have a short ride. As Akulina helped the little ones into the wagon, she took occasion to remind Poliki of the solemn promise he had made her not to touch a drop of vodka during the journey. Poliki drove the children as far as the blacksmith's place, where he let them out of the wagon, telling them they must return home. He then arranged his clothing and, setting his hat firmly on his head, started his horse on a trot. The two children, Mishka and Mashka, both barefooted, started running at such a rapid pace that a strange dog from another village, seeing them flying over the road, dropped his tail between his legs and ran home, squealing. The weather was very cold, a sharp, cutting wind blowing continuously, but this did not disturb Poliki, whose mind was engrossed with pleasant thoughts. As he rode through the wintry blasts, he kept repeating to himself, "So I am the man they wanted to send to Siberia, and whom they threatened to enroll as a soldier, the same man whom everyone abused, and said he was lazy, and who was pointed out as a thief and given the meanest work on the estate to do. Now I am going to receive a large sum of money, for which my mistress is sending me because she trusts me. I am also riding in the same wagon that the superintendent himself uses when he is riding as a representative of the court. I have the same harness, leather horse collar, reins, and all the other gear." Poliki, filled with pride at thought of the mission with which he had been entrusted, drew himself up with an air of pride, and fixing his old hat more firmly on his head, buttoned his coat tightly about him and urged his horse to greater speed. "Just to think," he continued, "I shall have in my possession 3,000 half-roubles, the peasant manner of speaking of money so as to make it appear a larger sum than it really is, and will carry them in my bosom. If I wished to, I might run away to Odessa instead of taking the money to my mistress. But no, I will not do that. I will surely carry the money straight to the one who has been kind enough to trust me." When Poliki reached the first kabak, tavern, he found that from long habit the mare was naturally turning her head toward it, but he would not allow her to stop, though money had been given him to purchase both food and drink. Striking the animal a sharp blow with the whip, he passed by the tavern. The performance was repeated when he reached the next kabak, which looked very inviting, but he resolutely set his face against entering and passed on. About noon, he arrived at his destination, and getting down from the wagon, approached the gate of the merchant's house, where the servants of the court always stopped. Opening it, he led the mare through and, after unharnessing her, fed her. This done, he next entered the house and had dinner with the merchant's workingmen, and to them he related what an important mission he had been sent on, making himself very amusing by the pompous air which he assumed. Dinner over, he carried a letter to the merchant which the noblewoman had given him to deliver. The merchant, knowing thoroughly the reputation which Poliki bore, felt doubtful of trusting him with so much money, and somewhat anxiously inquired if he really had received orders to carry so many roubles. Poliki tried to appear offended at this question, but did not succeed, and he only smiled. The merchant, after reading the letter a second time, and being convinced that all was right, gave Poliki the money, which he put in his bosom for safekeeping. On his way to the house, he did not once stop at any of the shops he passed. The clothing establishments possessed no attractions for him, and after he had safely passed them all, he stood for a moment, feeling very pleased that he had been able to withstand temptation, and then went on his way. "I have money enough to buy up everything," he said, "but I will not do so." The numerous commissions which he had received compelled him to go to the bazaar. There he bought only what had been ordered, but he could not resist the temptation to ask the price of a very handsome sheepskin coat which attracted his attention. The merchant to whom he spoke looked at Poliki and smiled, not believing that he had sufficient money to purchase such an expensive coat. But Poliki, pointing to his breast, said that he could buy out the whole shop if he wished to. He thereupon ordered the shopkeeper to take his measure. He tried the coat on and looked himself over carefully, testing the quality and blowing upon the hair to see that none of it came out. Finally, heaving a deep sigh, he took it off. "The price is too high," he said. "If you could let me have it for 15 roubles." But the merchant cut him short by snatching the coat from him and throwing it angrily to one side. Poliki left the bazaar and returned to the merchant's house in high spirits. After supper, he went out and fed the mare and prepared everything for the night. Returning to the house, he got up on the stove to rest, and while there he took out the envelope which contained the money and looked long and earnestly at it. He could not read, but asked one of those present to tell him what the writing on the envelope meant. It was simply the address and the announcement that it contained 1,500 roubles. The envelope was made of common paper and was sealed with dark brown sealing wax. There was one large seal in the center and 4 smaller ones at the corners. Poliki continued to examine it carefully, even inserting his finger till he touched the crisp notes. He appeared to take a childish delight in having so much money in his possession. Having finished his examination, he put the envelope inside the lining of his old battered hat, and placing both under his head, he went to sleep. But during the night, he frequently awoke, and always felt to know if the money was safe. Each time that he found that it was safe, he rejoiced at the thought that he, Poliki, abused and regarded by everyone as a thief, was entrusted with the care of such a large sum of money, and also that he was about to return with it quite as safely as the superintendent himself could have done. Chapter 5. Before dawn the next morning, Poliki was up, and after harnessing the mare and looking in his hat to see that the money was all right, he started on his return journey. Many times on the way, Poliki took off his hat to see that the money was safe. Once he said to himself, "I think that perhaps it would be better if I should put it in my bosom." This would necessitate the tying of his sash, so he decided to keep it still in his hat, or until he should have made half the journey, when he would be compelled to stop to feed his horse and to rest. He said to himself, "The lining is not sewn in very strongly, and the envelope might fall out, so I think I had better not take off my hat until I reach home." The money was safe, at least so it seemed to him, and he began to think how grateful his mistress would be to him, and in his excited imagination he saw the 5 roubles he was so sure of receiving. Once more, he examined the hat to see that the money was safe, and finding everything all right, he put on his hat and pulled it well down over his ears, smiling all the while at his own thoughts. Akolina had carefully sewed all the holes in the hat, but it burst out in other places owing to Poliki's removing it so often. In the darkness, he did not notice the new rents, and tried to push the envelope further under the lining, and in doing so pushed one corner of it through the plush. The sun was getting high in the heavens, and Poliki, having slept but little the previous night, and feeling its warm rays, fell fast asleep, after first pressing his hat more firmly on his head. By this action, he forced the envelope still further through the plush, and as he rode along, his head bobbed up and down. Poliki did not awake till he arrived near his own house, and his first act was to put his hand to his head to learn if his hat was all right. Finding that it was in its place, he did not think it necessary to examine it and see that the money was safe. Touching the mare gently with the whip, she started into a trot, and as he rode along, he arranged in his own mind how much he was to receive. With the air of a man already holding a high position at the court, he looked around him with an expression of lofty scorn on his face. As he neared his house, he could see before him the one room which constituted their humble home, and the joiner's wife next door carrying her rolls of linen. He saw also the office of the court and his mistress's house, where he hoped he would be able presently to prove that he was an honest, trustworthy man. He reasoned with himself that any person can be abused by lying tongues, but when his mistress would see him, she would say, "Well done, Poliki. You have shown that you can be honest. Here are 3, it may be 5, perhaps 10, roubles for you." And also she would order tea for him and might treat him to vodka. Who knows? The latter thought gave him great pleasure, as he was feeling very cold. Speaking aloud, he said, "What a happy holy day we can have with 10 roubles. Having so much money, I could pay Nikita the 4 roubles 50 kopecks which I owe him, and yet have some left to buy shoes for the children." When near the house, Poliki began to arrange his clothes, smoothing down his fur collar, retying his sash, and stroking his hair. To do the latter, he had to take off his hat, and when doing so, felt in the lining for the envelope. Quicker and quicker, he ran his hand around the lining, and not finding the money, used both hands, first one and then the other. But the envelope was not to be found. Poliki was by this time greatly distressed, and his face was white with fear as he passed his hand through the crown of his old hat. Poliki stopped the mare and began a diligent search through the wagon and its contents. Not finding the precious envelope, he felt in all his pockets, but the money could not be found. Wildly clutching at his hair, he exclaimed, "Batyushka, what will I do now? What will become of me?" At the same time, he realized that he was near his neighbor's house and could be seen by them. So he turned the mare around, and pulling his hat down securely upon his head, he rode quickly back in search of his lost treasure. Chapter 6. The whole day passed without anyone in the village of Pokrovsky having seen anything of Poliki. During the afternoon, his mistress inquired many times as to his whereabouts and sent Aksiutka frequently to Akulina, who each time sent back word that Poliki had not yet returned, saying also that perhaps the merchant had kept him, or that something had happened the mare. His poor wife felt a heavy load upon her heart and was scarcely able to do her housework and put everything in order for the next day, which was to be a holy day. The children also anxiously awaited their father's appearance, and though for different reasons could hardly restrain their impatience. The noblewoman and Akugina were concerned only in regard to Poliki himself, while the children were interested most in what he would bring them from the town. The only news received by the villagers during the day concerning Poliki was to the effect that neighboring peasants had seen him running up and down the road and asking everyone he met if he or she had found an envelope. One of them had seen him also walking by the side of his tired-out horse. "I thought," said he, "that the man was drunk and had not fed his horse for 2 days. The animal looked so exhausted." Unable to sleep, and with her heart palpitating at every sound, Akulina lay awake all night vainly awaiting Poliki's return. When the cock crowed the 3rd time, she was obliged to get up to attend to the fire. Day was just dawning, and the church bells had begun to ring. Soon all the children were also up, but there were still no tidings of the missing husband and father. In the morning, the chill blasts of winter entered their humble home, and on looking out, they saw that the houses, fields, and roads were thickly covered with snow. The day was clear and cold, as if befitting the holy day they were about to celebrate. They were able to see a long distance from the house, but no one was in sight. Aquilina was busy baking cakes, and had it not been for the joyous shouts of the children, she would not have known that Poliki was coming up the road. For a few minutes later, he came in with a bundle in his hand and walked quietly to his corner. Aquilina noticed that he was very pale and that his face bore an expression of suffering, as if he would like to have cried, but could not do so. But she did not stop to study it, but excitedly inquired, "What? Illich, is everything all right with you?" He slowly muttered something, but his wife could not understand what he said. "What?" she cried out. "Have you been to see our mistress?" Poliki still sat on the bed in his corner, glaring wildly about him and smiling bitterly. He did not reply for a long time, and Aquilina again cried, "Eh, Illich, why don't you answer me? Why don't you speak?" Finally he said, "Aquilina, I delivered the money to our mistress, and oh, how she thanked me." Then he suddenly looked about him, with an anxious, startled air, and with a sad smile on his lips. Two things in the room seemed to engross the most of his attention: the baby in the cradle and the rope which was attached to the ladder. Approaching the cradle, he began with his thin fingers quickly to untie the knot in the rope by which. The two were connected. After untying it, he stood for a few moments looking silently at the baby. Aquilina did not notice this proceeding, and with her cakes on the board went to place them in a corner. Poliki quickly hid the rope beneath his coat and again seated himself on the bed. "What is it that troubles you, Illich?" inquired Aquilina. "You are not yourself." "I have not slept," he answered. Suddenly, a dark shadow crossed the window, and a minute later, the girl Axiutka quickly entered the room, exclaiming, "The Boyarinia commands you, Poliki Illich, to come to her this moment." Poliki looked first at Aquilina and then at the girl. "This moment," he cried. "What more is wanted?" He spoke the last sentence so softly that Aquilina became quieted in her mind, thinking that perhaps their mistress intended to reward her husband. "Say that I will come immediately," he said. But Poliki failed to follow the girl and went instead to another place. From the porch of his house, there was a ladder reaching to the attic. Arriving at the foot of the ladder, Poliki looked around him, and seeing no one about, he quickly ascended to the garret. Meanwhile, the girl had reached her mistress's house. "What does it mean that Poliki does not come?" said the noblewoman impatiently. "Where can he be? Why does he not come at once?" Axiutka flew again to his house and demanded to see Poliki. "He went a long time ago," answered Aquilina, and looking around with an expression of fear on her face, she added, "He may have fallen asleep somewhere on the way." About this time the joiner's wife, with hair unkempt and clothes bedraggled, went up to the loft to gather the linen which she had previously put there to dry. Suddenly a cry of horror was heard, and the woman, with her eyes closed and crazed by fear, ran down the ladder like a cat. "Illich," she cried, "has hanged himself." Poor Aquilina ran up the ladder before any of the people who had gathered from the surrounding houses could prevent her. With a loud shriek, she fell back as if dead, and would surely have been killed had not one of the spectators succeeded in catching her in his arms. Before dark the same day, a peasant of the village, while returning from the town, found the envelope containing Poliki's money on the roadside, and soon after delivered it to the Boyarinia.